Say today. And he came out of Washington, D.C., where he was with the news agency there, and came to the Ozarks, and drove down and found this old woman living in a cabin with no electricity and no running water and no plumbing and he just absolutely, so they walked into the house and she said, well, drag a chair over next to the fire. I put a real big log in so we can sit and talk. So there they sat, frozen to death, knees almost touching, sitting in a little circle by the fire, trying to keep warm, and just holes in the wall big enough to throw small cats through. I tell that story too. I'm not going to try and tell it now. There was a truly wicked story just flashed through my brain. I'm not going to tell. Let's see. What I need is this is a slightly scary story. Ever since the war ended, people have sat around a fire, sat around a fireplace. You can't manage anything else, sat around a candle and told stories. And we always think, that that's the ideal way to tell stories. Well, are you ready?
We're ready.
The story that wants to be told is denting at the back of my brain, and I'm fighting it down, but I'm not having any luck. Now, you've probably heard about all of the refugees that settle down in Florida. The Haitian refugees, and the Cuban refugees, and everybody fleeing from countries that don't much want them to countries that will take them in. There was a girl, she had been born down in the Caribbean. I just started a really scary story that both those little children are way too small for. I'm sorry.
You know what? We'll come back later, okay?
Okie doke. I'm probably going to be above their verbal level, but I don't want them to get scared.
Okay, we'll come back later, okay?
Okay. And there was this girl, she was probably 13 and had just started the junior high. She lived in a little apartment with only about 3 rooms, and there were probably 18 people jammed, all of them immigrants like her and her mama. Daddy had died years before, so it was just her and her mama. Well, her mama worked hard, but there was lots of stuff that girl didn't get. And one day, as she was packing up her book bag to go to school, her mama said to her, she said, old Mrs. Buffouet from next door has died. Go to the funeral home down on such and such a street and pay our respects. I have to go to work. I can't, but you can go for the both of us. And she said she would. So when school was out, she caught the bus from school to where she needed to go. She got off at that pink stucco building with the seashells carved into the, oh, it was very pretty, because the seashells were painted bright pink, and the pillars in front of the funeral home were painted bright green. It was the prettiest house she had ever seen, except for the fact that it was a funeral home. And she went in very timidly with her book bag held against her, and she said to the girl who was sitting at the desk, painting her long, long fingernails, Mrs. Buffouet. And the woman said, oh yes, down the hall, second door on the left. And the girl went down the hall. But first she went around the hall and she said, oh dear, was I supposed to count that door? Or was I supposed to start counting with this door? Did she mean after the second door on the left, or just the second door on the left? In her confusion, she opened a door and walked in. Well, she knew right off it was not Mrs. Buffouet, who was probably 80 years old. It was a girl about her age. And she started to turn and walk out, and then she noticed That girl about her age with the black hair just like hers was wearing the most beautiful dress she had ever seen. It was so pretty. And then she looked, and there, sticking up from behind that girl's neck, was the price tag. It was brand new, and they were getting ready to bury that girl in that dress. It was enough money. She knew that her family, her mother would never make enough money to buy a dress like that for her. Everything she wore came from the thrift shop and cost $2. And the funeral director walked into the room. He was a very slick man. His fingers were manicured. His hair was slicked back. And he came in and he said, "Saying goodbye to your little friend, make it quick because I'm going to close the casket and it'll be closed from now on." And he reached down and he picked up this wrench, a wrench like she'd never seen. It had a wooden handle and a long brass stem and then a thing on the end of it that looked just like a flower. She was fascinated because the man put the lid of the coffin down and stuck that wrench with the flower part in and started turning it to lock the lid down. Just then, as he was about to start on the second lid, he stuck the wrench in, and there was a shriek from across the hall. Someone who had come to say goodbye to a loved one had been overcome by grief. "Oh, heavens," said the man as he ran out the door. Well, there she was. She looked at that wrench, and she tried it. It was amazing how easily it turned. And then she thought, what a shame that that brand new dress was going to be buried. But he said the coffin wouldn't be opened again. Well, she took that wrench and she undid the top, pushed it up, and it was a matter of just a few seconds for her to slip that dress down and off that girl. It wasn't even fastened in the back, just tucked under her. She slipped that dress off and stuffed it in her book bag, and then she put the lid down, and just about then the funeral director came back in and said, "Still here? Isn't it time for you to be running along?" He grabbed the wrench and kept tightening. She said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm gone," and she ran out the door. She didn't stop running until she got all the way to her house. She went upstairs and hid in the closet because if anybody saw that dress, they would know that she had not come by it honestly. But it was so beautiful, and there was going to be a dance that night. She had told the young boy that she was kind of sweet on that she couldn't come because she didn't have anything correct to wear. She hid in the closet and she tried it on. It fit like it had been made for her. So she hung it back in the end of the closet where no one else could see it. She ate her supper and then she said, "I've got homework. I've got to go upstairs, Mama." So she went up to the room that she shared with her mother and her brother. And there she couldn't put on the dress. She climbed down the trellis because if her mother saw her in the dress, she knew her mother would know. Climbed down the trellis, put the dress on in the darkness just outside of the house, and then ran for the school. When she got there, the music was playing, and everybody turned and looked at her as she walked in because she was so pretty. And then she began to dance. As she was dancing, first with her boyfriend and then with other boys who had never noticed before how pretty she was, but with the new dress on, she was pretty. And she danced, but she began to feel really cold. She said, "Is it cold in here?" And her boyfriend said, "No, I'm sweating." She said, "I'm going to go to the bathroom." So she went into the bathroom and she stood there. Her feet were cold. Her hands were cold. She went in and looked at her hair and thought, "No, So she warmed her hands under the water in the bathroom, and then she went back out and kept on dancing. But gradually it felt as if she could barely move her legs and her arms. She went back into the bathroom. One girl came in and she said, "Would you help me?" And she took the dress off. Looked all over on the inside of it, but not a thing could be seen. So she put the dress back on and went back out and began to dance, and then suddenly she couldn't move a muscle. She couldn't move at all, and she just fell, thump, onto her back. Her boyfriend hollered for one of the sponsors. They ran over and she heard somebody say, "Call 911." And they were down taking her pulse. And somebody said, "Oh, golly, she's already dead." But she started to say, "I'm not dead. I'm right here." But she couldn't move a muscle. No one could tell if she was even breathing or not. The ambulance came, and men from the ambulance said, "No, she's dead." But she wanted to say, "I'm not dead. I'm right here." But she couldn't. Her eyes were open and she could see the men standing around her, and then somebody closed her eyes and she couldn't see anymore, but she could hear. She could hear girls crying. Her boyfriend saying, "But she was fine. She was fine until just now." Well, she felt herself being put on a stretcher, wheeled out to the ambulance, and the ambulance took her to the funeral home. People came, her mother came, and cried, and she tried and tried to say, "No, Mama, it's all right. I'm right here." But not a word could she utter. Not a piece of her could she move. She got to hear her own funeral, something that people very rarely get to do. She did hear her mother wonder aloud where the funeral people got that beautiful dress her girl was buried in. And finally, she was being taken down to the graveyard. Two men with shovels came over to start throwing the dirt in the grave. And one of them said to the other one, "Did you hear?" And the other one said, "What?" He said, "Did you hear about that girl? We were just about to put her in the grave and cover her up, and she started screaming and banging on the inside of the coffin. When we got it open, she said that she hadn't been dead but was alive. She had a dress that had voodoo powder put in the seams of it that made her stiff, lifeless, like she was dead." And the other one said, "How about that? But when she came out of the coffin, the man said she didn't have anything on but a slip." "Huh," said the other man. "I wonder what happened to that dress." And a shovelful of dirt came into the grave and landed, thump, on the top of the coffin. And the other one said, "I don't know. How do you figure?" Thump. And the other one said, "We'll never figure it out." Thump. I told you it was scary. See why I ran those little bitty kids off? Oh, white dress. That's actually my husband's story, but I tell it occasionally. That one was necking at the back of my head. Hi there.
Hello.
I don't have to tell scary stuff. Yeah, yes I do. Oh, come on. They say, well, if any more little kids. Yeah, you can go out that way if you want to.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Oh, you're welcome.
Another one.
Oh.
You're just right outside.
Just a second. I tell this to kids as small as 4 and grade school kids as old as 6th grade. But it's because they grew up on this story. This story is my multi-purpose story. Once upon a time, there was a house made out of hemp stalks. In it lived an old man, an old woman, and a little girl. And outside their doghouse lived little dog Turpie. Now, it was Turpie's job. Every single night while everybody was in the house sleeping, she would stay in the doghouse and she would keep a watch. Well, one night she was doing her job. They were sleeping. She was watching, and the hop-yahs came from the mountain. They were going hop-yah, 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 tear down the hemp stalks, eat the old man and woman, carry off the little girl. Well, Turpie rushed out of her doghouse and she said, "Bah!" And the hop-yahs, they ran away. And the old man turned in his bed. He said, "Little dog, collards." I just finished dinner just a moment ago. He said, "A little dog Turpie barks, so I can neither sleep nor slumber. If I live till tomorrow, I'm going to cut off her tail." Next morning he did. That night the hop-yahs came again. Hop-yah, 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 tear down the hemp stalks, eat the old man and woman, carry off the little girl. Well, Turpie, she rushed out and said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, whoa," and the hop-yahs, they ran away because they knew somebody was watching. And the old man turned in his bed He said, little dog Turby barks, so I can neither sleep nor slumber. If I live till tomorrow, I'm going to cut off her ears. Well, the next morning he did. And the Javias came in. Javia tear down the hemp stalk, come in, close the door. Tear down the hemp stalks, eat the old man and woman, carry off the little girl. Well, Turby, she said, bow, wow, wow, and the Javias, they ran away. And the old man turned in his bed and he said, little dog Turby barks, so I can neither sleep nor slumber. If I live till tomorrow, I'm going to cut off one of her legs. Next morning he did that night. The Javias came again. Javia, 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 tear down the hemp stalks, eat the old man and woman, carry off the little girl. Well, Turby, she said, woof! One big woof, and the old man, Javias, ran away. And the old man turned in his bed. He said, little dog Turby barks, so I can neither sleep nor slumber. If I live till tomorrow, I'm going to cut off her head. Next morning he did that night. The Javias came back. Javia, 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 tear down the hemp stalks, eat the old man and woman, carry off the little girl. Well, Turby didn't say anything, so the Javias, they tore down the hemp stalk house. They ate that old man. They ate the old woman. They put the little girl in a sack and they tied it shut, and a bunch of them picked her up and carried her off up to the mountains. All night long they danced around the sack going, hop-ya, hop-ya, hop-ya. They run over and untie the sack and say, look at me, and the little girl would scream. And they'd come back and untie the sack and say, look at me, and the little girl would cry. Come the dawn, all the Javias went back under the mountain because they only come out in the dark. They left the little girl sitting tied in the sack. Well, that morning a hunter came by with a gun and a big black dog. He said, I believe that sack up there is crying, because the little girl was, but the dog's way ahead of him. He's always running up the hill, snurfling around that sack, wagging his big fluffy tail. And the hunter said, well, I'm going to go look in that sack. So he walked up the hill and untied the sack, and the little girl screamed. And he said, why are you screaming at me? She said, oh, I thought you was a Javias that ate the old man and ate the old woman and had come back to eat me up. And he said, no. And he took the little girl out of the sack, took her home to be his little girl. But before he left, he put the big black dog in the sack, tied it shut just like it'd been. That night all the Javias came going, Javia, 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 and they ran over and untied the sack. He said, look at me. And the big black dog said, and he ate all those Javias down to their last toenail, which is the reason there ain't no more Javias today. Another one just jumped in.
You found another one?
Yeah, I'm on one more. Then I'm gonna have to hush because the boys are gonna be back over here. They're picking music.
What are Javias?
Well, I don't know. They ate them. I don't know. I don't explain them. I just tell them. There was, and you're a little too old. One time I told that when I was making a recording of that particular bunch of stories, and I told the kids at the Reed Spring grade school, who were my live audience, I said, if you draw me pictures of these creatures, then I'm going to tell you a story. And I told them a bunch of stories. I said, I'll put them on the cover. You know, every one of those kindergartners knew what Javias looked like. I mean, exactly. I don't think they were copying off of each other. I think they knew what they looked like. Yeah, by the time you're a third or fourth grader, you don't know anymore. Yeah, there was, this is a weird story. Once there was a little town, and to this little town came a city boy. I don't know if he'd been raised in that little town and then come home or what, but he came home and oh, he was proud of himself. He kept bragging about how rich he was and how smart he was and how well dressed he was and how brave he was until the local boys were ready to kill him. And finally, one of them said, okay, city boy, if you're so smart, why don't you spend the night in the haunted house up on the hill? Oh, you superstitious hillbillies. Well, it went downhill from there. So pretty soon, here was the city boy. They had agreed who would get what from whom if he could or couldn't spend the night in the haunted house. So he got him a little bait of, well, that was crooked as all get out. Where'd that come from? He got himself a little bait of supper in a bag and took himself a lantern and he went up to the house. But you know that house? It looked like the people that had lived there just left. I mean, there was wood in the wood pile, there was furniture, and shoot, there was clothes hung in the closet. Well, he went in and built him a little fire, warmed his supper in, was sitting in a rocking chair right in front of the fireplace. And he was sitting there rocking, and boy, it was actually kind of dull. Not a thing had happened. Not a sound had he heard, except down in town he could hear the clock that was up on the steeple of the county seat there in the courthouse. He heard it ringing the hours. Well, he heard 8 and then 9, and he didn't hear 10 or 11, but when he finally struggled back awake, he heard down in town it go bong, bong. But I won't bother you with the rest of them. It was midnight, and on that very last bong, the door that he really thought he had locked, you know, latched, the door went, and around that corner of the door came this little half-grown kitten. You know, one of them kittens that they have grown big enough, they're not tiny kittens anymore, but they've still, their head's this big around and their ears are adult size. Yeah, kids do that sometimes too, you know. So this little tabby cat kitten, little kitten, came wandering into the room, and he kind of rubbed on the rocking chair leg, and he came over and kind of rubbed on the feller's ankle, and then he sat down right on the floor, right between the feller and the fireplace, and looked at the feller, and the feller looked at the kitten, and the little kitten went and looked at the door. Well, the city feller looked at the door, and the door went a little wider open, and around the corner of the door came, well, you'd have thought it was a bobcat. It was a big, long-legged cat, but it had a big, long tail. And it came a-padding into the room, and it came in and it sat down right next to the kitten in a row, right there in front of the fireplace, and then looked at the city feller, and the city feller looked at it, swallowed hard, and the cat went, looked down at the kitten and said, "Shall we start?" And the kitten said, "Nah, let's wait for Martin." Well, the city fella's, he's sweating bullets now, but the door went, and in came a cat, big as a mountain lion, but it was a tabby cat. It came a-padding into the door, big long teeth in his mouth, sat down right there with them other 2 cats in a row, and he looked at the city feller, and the city feller looked at him, really sweating bullets by this time, and the cat went and looked down at the kitten and said, "Shall we start?" And the kitten said, "Nah, let's wait for Martin." Well, the city feller's coming unglued now. He's shaking all over, but just then the door went bam, and in walked, well, it must have been a booger cat, because it was about the size of a 2-year-old steer. But it was one of them black cats, had a little white, you know, little white bib under here, had a tail about 8 foot long, feet about the size of a pie pan, and he came a-pad and kind of had to duck to get through the doorway, and he came a-padding in, and he padded over, and he sat down with them other cats right in front of the fireplace, and he looked at the city feller, and the city feller looked at him, and the cat went with a tongue that was about as long as a dish rag, looked down at the kitten and said, "Shall we start?" And the kitten said, "Nah, let's wait for Martin." Oh, the city feller couldn't stand it. He screamed and jumped toward the nearest window and just jumped right through it, glass flying in every direction. He rolled and tumbled, bleeding most of the way. Glass got him as he went through, down to the bottom of the hill, and he jumped up to run, and he looked up, and there's cat heads looking all through the window. And he said, "You tell Martin I couldn't wait." And he ran back to town. And the next morning, he paid what he owed on that bet with a smile on his face. That's all I know about that one. I like that so much.
Let's go.
Waiting for Martin. You know, I've had more people tell me that story. And the amazing thing is, whatever they're waiting for is always named Martin. Sometimes it's devils, sometimes it's cats, but it's always named Martin. And, you know, you get one of them circuit riding preachers, that's half the money he makes.
Yeah.
And he's sitting there, and the farm wife knew what she was doing. She had an enormous platter full of chicken, a little dab of green beans, a little bit of mashed potatoes.
Yeah.
That's what he took, was a spoonful of mashed potatoes and a spoonful of green beans. Most of the chicken. Well, you know, the farmer got a neck and the wife got a wing and the preacher ate the rest of it. I mean, he was stuffed, well, it was his pay, you see.
Well, that's his pay for the week, boy.
Richard's granddaddy was a circuit riding Baptist preacher, and people used to say, you know, he would preach by whatever was on the Lord's Supper table after the collection.
Yeah.
You know, if he looked down and all there was greens and some spinach and a couple of turnips, he didn't preach much of something. But Lord, if somebody brought a chicken, he could preach him up. So here's the preacher. He's done everything, and he's sitting there picking his teeth, patting his belly, and a rooster flew up outside of the window and commenced to cock-a-doodle-doo. And the preacher was going, man, oh man. He looked at the woman, he said, that's some proud rooster you got out there. And the farmer said, yeah, you'd be proud too if 3 of your sons just entered the ministry. I like that one, Bunch.